AWCA, Mike Amore. Welcome back, everyone. Spring 2019, summer's coming. I get to hit more golf balls into the woods. Today's topic, we're going to talk about how to create changes in the position that favor you or give you play, give you chances to create problems for your opponent. The technical term for that is something known as an imbalance. Just think of you having a knight, me having a bishop. That's a minor piece imbalance. Think of you having two isolated pawns and my pawns not being isolated. We would have a pawn structure imbalance or a difference in our position. If you look at the starting position here, this is played between two Bens from 2 o'clock. Ben P playing black and Ben Z playing white. There aren't many differences at all. We're just getting out of the opening. Nothing's been traded yet, so there are no imbalances. The kings are on the same side of the board. You know, if you can imagine black castled on this side, then there's a difference in the position. Maybe the players would pawn storm one another. But here, because everything is pretty much symmetrical, or at least even in terms of imbalances, white decides to develop their last piece and plays bishop e3, which is a really good move. You connect the rooks. Now, I was extremely happy to see Ben Z, and from now on, I'm just going to say white because the Bens are going to drive everybody crazy. But when Ben first came to the WCA, he had a habit of moving too many pawns before developing his pieces. Now, if you look at the way he's playing chess, he almost never gets into the middle game without all of his pieces developed. So it's a really good sign of improvement. So here, after this move, black has a question. You know, do I make the trade? If you make the trade, if you take on e3, if you're playing the white pieces, you can take back either way. But I think a lot of people would take with the F pawn, which already creates some differences. Do you guys see how the pawn structure has changed? That white now has two e-pawns. Those two e-pawns, while they're doubled, could be weak if they get attacked later in the game, but right now, these doubled pawns are right in the middle of the board. They're extremely powerful. If I put these two highlights on, you see the new e-pawn that was on f2? The fact that it's on e3 now means it's controlling f4 and d4. This knight here on c6 always loves to hop into that square, and that's a no-no right now. Another highlight, if that trade happens, is the f file is now half open for white. So this knight may move, try to come into f5. The rook would have access to the file. The knight here on c3 hopping into d5, and you can see the bishop already pointing at the black king. So when you add all of that up, white gets an enormous amount of play, or at least potential, if that trade happens. So when you go back, I think black said, nah, I'm not quite ready to give you that trade. So what I'm going to do instead is just back this thing up to b6. And here, white decides to make the trade. It's not the end of the world, and it certainly doesn't lose. But when you make the trade, you have to ask a very simple question. Did the trade help me or my opponent? And I think, obviously, black has to take back. But with which pawn? Well, in this case, you would almost always take with your A pawn, and that would open your rook, and plus your A pawn becomes a B pawn, and you'll notice this B pawn is controlling C5. That's much closer to the center than it was when it was on A7. Okay, so I think that trade helped black a little bit, but really not the end of the world again. So let's follow what we're trying to study this game, creating differences in the position. So already black has an A file or a half open A file to work with. The pawn structure has changed a little bit, but again, it's still nothing major. What does white do? White follows one of the middle game principles. So a lot of us get confused in the middle game. Hey, I got my pieces out. I have my rooks connected. What am I supposed to do? Couple of ideas. Improve a piece. Get a piece, put it on a better square. Challenge one of your opponent's pieces. And white and black have kind of already done that with that little bishop dance that they did. But here, white plunks the knight in on d5. And rather than taking, black decides to develop their last minor piece and put some pressure on the center. And here, white takes. And when you take, you probably want to take with your queen here because, you know, you don't want to shatter the pawns in front of your king. So you take back with the queen. But you'll notice when those trades went down, all of a sudden both sides have their rooks connected and, you know, still very, very equal game. Very equal, right? Now watch this. In the game, white played the move a3. And I think white was thinking, you know, this bishop, this rook here is putting a lot of pressure on this pawn, and I don't think I want this rook to have to spend the middle game defending the a pawn because this bishop might get traded, and I don't want to lose this thing. So he plays pawn to a3, but by doing so, it gave black a chance here in this position to start creating imbalances. And if you play like a robot here as white, you can get in a lot of trouble. Now, let's take a look at a possible variation. One, we can just pin the knight. And the idea of pinning the knight is to put two pieces on this square here on f3. And at some point, when this bishop takes the knight, the g-pawn is going to have to move. You guys see that? I don't want to really move the pieces. I want you guys to be able to do this in your head. If you pin the knight, there's nothing white can do to stop you from taking that knight. If they trade the queens, then you're going to have a g-pawn here. So you know what? I'm going to be really nice. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to make a random move. Let's move this rook here. All right? If I take, if the queens come off, this is what I was talking about. Already, you see how things have changed dramatically. The pawn structure has really been chopped up. The problem for white in this position is, what about a move like knight d4, which instantly creates problems? It's attacking two pawns. So number one, you're going to win something. Number two, let's even pretend, I'll make another random move. I'll just throw this rook back here. Now, you guys see that white can win two different pawns in this position. But let's go a step further and say, you know what? Forget about winning the pawns. Sometimes, you know, just pretend those pawns are protected. You see how the pawn structure changed because of that trade that I made? Imagine you playing this check and the king moving, and then you hopping this knight into f4. Now, clearly, earlier, white should have grabbed some of those pawns. White's probably even winning in the line that I showed you. But I'm just showing you this maneuver because of the imbalance between bishop and knight. Look at this knight. This is an outposted knight. Every WCA student by now should know what an outpost is. If you don't, you need to talk to me in class. Hey, Mike, I don't know what an outpost is. This knight is really, really difficult to deal with, okay? So if you go back to bishop g4, there's an opportunity there for black to really mix things up by breaking the pawn structure. There's a bit more. Okay, back to the original. This is where white just played pawn a3. Here in this position, what if we just take the bishop? And this could have happened in the game. It didn't, but I want to share it with you. If you take the bishop, white has to take back. You can't go down a piece, right? So we take back. And here, again, black is not winning, but black has some ideas here to create problems for white. If you played a move like queen e6, it puts pressure on this pawn here. You see that? And that means the queen is going to be tied down to the pawn for a while. But there is another reason why the queen moves away from e6. And I remember making a video for chesskid.com where I told the kids there, anytime you see a master move a piece and you're not 100% sure why the piece moved, always look at the square it left. because sometimes there's a clue. So why on earth would black be interested in moving the queen away from the f6 square? Can you guys figure it out? You can always pause your video. Yeah, the idea would be to open the f pawn for a pawn break. So let's go back to this for a second. You put the queen on e6, you put pressure on the c pawn. The c pawn's protected by the queen. The queen's going to say, hey, do I have to spend my whole life defending this pawn? No. It's hard to push this pawn. You see that extra control that black has on the c5 square? You're not pushing this thing. You're going to lose a pawn. So a very natural thing to do would be to play a move like b3 to protect it. You could also drop the knight to d2, but then all of a sudden black is kind of pushing forward and white is going backwards. So I've seen so many games played where players will play a move like b3 just to protect the weak pawn, right? Well, look at the lines. The rook on a1 is now, a8 is now tying down the rook on a1, so this pawn can become weak again. You see what just happened there? Number one, you guys see why this arrow is here? And all of these ideas come from simply making differences between your position and mine. Now, I'll put notes in the blog for this whole video. Please make sure you read the notes and come to me with any questions, okay? So watch what could have happened here. You play the move b3, and here comes f5. There's a pawn break. If you continue to take, and again, black is not crushing white at this point, but notice what happens once the rook takes. Now this rook up here feels the pressure from the rook on a1, so what if they just play a very natural move like a4 to free this rook? Well, this rook is now looking at a brick wall. What do you think it's going to do? It's going to come over. And if white is not careful, like in this position, I think they're almost forced to guard the d4 square or move this knight, because if you don't, you're going to run into a tactic. For example, let's say that white follows the principle in the middle game. Give your king an escape square if there's rooks and queens that can get to your back rank. Well, look at black's rooks and queen. They're really powerful, right? If you randomly make an escape square by playing a move like h3, you can resign. You guys see what's going to happen here? Rook takes knight, game over. White is crushed. You cannot take that rook back, which means you just lost the knight for nothing, and black continues their attack. If you take with the pawn, then you get hit with knight to d4. And the problem with knight d4, aside from hitting the queen, it also hits this pawn with check. The queen knows that this area is being attacked, so she might play a move like queen e4, and now black just plays queen takes h3. Knight takes f3 is checkmate. You have no way to stop that other than giving away your queen. Game is over. Okay, you guys, hopefully you got a good feel for what could have happened in this game. Let me just show you a couple of more moves from what did happen. So here's a3 where we really got into the discussion. And rather than, either pinning the knight or taking the bishop like I showed you, Ben with black decided to play queen g6. So I don't know if he was thinking of taking the bishop and breaking. I'm not sure. He could have done several things from here, but white decided to take. And here a pretty cool thing happened in class. Ben with black almost instantly played queen takes e6. And I stopped him here and I said, go back for a second. Do you see another capture? And he said, yeah. And then I pointed out if you had taken with the f pawn, I showed him some of the same exact ideas that could have happened in this video. And he was a pretty honest kid. He said, you know what, I kind of like your idea, but I shouldn't play it because I've already moved my queen. I thought that was a pretty cool thing that he did. But again, here we go. This is from your work. If they take, maybe in the future, we taking with the pawn, the reason to create differences in the two positions, okay? You guys are really getting good. You know why I know you're getting good? Because you're getting very difficult to teach. It's really hard to teach chess at this level. You're doing a great job. See you on Sunday.